Nice to see you. Welcome to week 4 of COMP6080. What's exciting about this week is that many of you watching today will have submitted your second assignment, which is first assignment, sorry, getting ahead of myself. Submitted your first assignment, so congratulations to all of those who have submitted that. I'm sure it was very tiring for some of you who submitted it over the weekend. I definitely saw some people who were working quite late on that assignment, so congratulations again for getting through that. I saw a lot of good work being done by people, and particularly what was really exciting was seeing how kind of on top of the learning everyone got there. A lot of people who really kind of just stuck in and tried to teach themselves some new things, so big congrats for that. What we're going to be chatting about today, and today is not meant to be extremely arduous for you because I'm sure many of you are tired, but today's kind of a chance to chat a little bit about some of the content that went down in week 3. So in week 3, there was a lot of content about web browsers, right? A lot of over there. There's a lot of content about web browsers, the DOM, events, forms, local storage. A lot of this was really important for task 4 of the assignment. Many of you probably, did task 4. So you probably found it easier than task 3, which is the point. Task 3 is kind of the hardest part of the assignment. Task 4 is just as I said previously, it's just a little bit of a starting point to get into assignment 2, just to help you get started. So all of what we're going to be talking about today is really about task 4 stuff. It's about JavaScript and DOM manipulation. What's going to be happening is next week we will be doing a demo with assignment 2, so we'll actually be starting assignment 2 together. That's not saying that you should wait until next week to start it. The point of next week's lecture is actually for all the people who haven't started it and are falling behind. We like to start it together just to give them a little bit of a leg up. But this week's all just about manipulating the DOM. And next week is going to be about manipulating the DOM and doing so in the context of the asynchronous parts of JavaScript. So, the fetch parts and the promises parts. So nothing about today is on fetches and promises for those who've gone ahead. Obviously, most of what you're going to be watching in week 4 lectures, in terms of the pre-recorded lectures, are about promises and fetch. So all of this stuff is really critical for assignment 2. And then next week we kind of touch on this. So a lot of good lectures here. I'm pretty sure these 3 lectures are new. I've recorded these this term. And then these are from a previous term. So lots of fun stuff. Hopefully it'll feel a lot more like a very programming-y week. Definitely the DOM manipulation stuff feels a bit more programmy than, say, HTML and CSS. But you will certainly find this week, as well as a bit of last week, feels a little bit more, I guess, close to home for some people. So today, predominantly, we're going to be doing a demonstration of JavaScript in the web browser. That demonstration focuses pretty heavily on this just simple, straightforward oh my god, why did it get cut off? That's so strange. I don't know why that happened. It just focuses on this. So we're essentially going to do an activity together where we will explore how to build a page with the JavaScript DOM. Now, to contrast, what happened in task 4 with your first assignment, you were doing a lot of stuff with event listeners and forms. A lot more of what we might be doing today might be around DOM construction. So you probably weren't doing a lot of DOM construction in task 4. And in fact, this week in your tutes, you're going to be doing some DOM construction as well. So, yeah. For those of you who got through task 3 in the assignment, again, to finish task 3 was very much a kind of a high distinction student, level. So for those of you who got through task 3, congratulations if that's the kind of, I guess, caliber that you're aiming for in the course. So let's get into this demo together. So What we're doing is we're building a really simple form for a communication tool, and we're going to be building it in what we call vanilla JavaScript, which is just all the kinds of JavaScript that you've been doing for task 4. What we want it to do is we want it to have some information that says, please invite your friends to join CSE at the top, so just kind of some text or something. We want it to have a text area with a welcome message, okay? So text area being the actual, HTML input, and that's going to have some kind of spot to enter a welcome message. When someone clicks off that box, right, when they blur off that box, if the field's empty, we want the background to become red. Underneath that, we're going to have 2 inputs for email addresses with an add more button at the bottom, and every time you click add more, it adds like another 2, right? So it goes like 2 to 4 to 6 to 8. And then we want a submit button at the end that when you click it, it provides a little summary screen, maybe something that pops up, before allowing the user to either cancel or continue, right? Cool. So Reese has asked a good question just as we get stuck into it. I think I will answer this question as we go because it is a particularly good question. So what I've got here is I've got a really simple text file. We've got it open. I might copy all this in just so we can reference it whilst we work. Right, so I know my face is there, but you kind of remember what's written here essentially, because it's all just what we read out before. So I've got my really simple web page. I'm going to go to 2-space indenting because I think that's just a little bit easier. We've got our head, and we'll just call this our CSE communication tool. Right, and then we have our body here. So simple enough page, and then inside the body, in general, this is what I would probably recommend when you construct web pages yourself, is actually go and just write out the key components. So like, up here, that we're going to have some kind of header that says, please invite your friends to join CSE. I know the comment's in the way here. That'll be gone in a sec. It's a big comment. And then underneath that, it says has a text area. Okay, so a text area. I'll write welcome message. Text area and text area. Underneath that, it says there's 2 inputs. So I'm going to, put input type equals text, a couple of inputs like that, and then a submit button. So I like to do submit buttons as buttons. I don't really like inputs that are of type submit. I think they're somewhat inflexible. So I think a button is a little bit better, but it depends what you're trying to do. Both are fine. Both can work fine. Okay, cool. So I refresh the page. I have all my core components here, right? Now you can see that a lot of these components are inline, which is going to create this strange style. So let's go and try and tidy those up just a little bit. One thing that I will do is I will put all of these email inputs in a div, and I'll call it email inputs, like this. And then my button at the bottom, the div, because the div's a block element, it should take care of that. And then here, my welcome message, maybe I'll put that on a new line as well. Now, something that we covered in a tutorial question, which I don't think we really covered in the lecture, because last week's lecture was about Node.js, is the use of online libraries like Bootstrap. So just whilst we're here, I will actually use Bootstrap. There is a tutorial, I think there's a tutorial question on this, pretty sure it's somewhere, where we dived into this a little bit more, but you'll definitely be wanting to use a library like this for assignment 2. There's a few other ones around the internet like Material UI, and I can essentially just go and take the entire library and import it onto my page. I believe that was the link, wasn't it? Usually putting it inside my head like this. And what this will do is that it will allow me to use the Bootstrap library components to improve my page and make it look how I want to. So for instance, there's a pre-recorded lecture on this, that's right. There's a pre-recorded lecture on this, so you can go and watch that for more detail, but what I will be doing is basically just stealing some classes and stuff from the Bootstrap library to make things look a little bit nicer. So for instance, with my inputs, if I give them a class of form control, okay, now they start to look a little bit nicer already, and I can go and clean these things up further if I want to. I might for those who attended my tute, you'll remember this because we went through this in some detail, but let's just say I'm going to copy and paste this. I'll give it a second class name for email inputs, and then I can see here that email input 1, email address 1, name at example.com, and then we can try and do this again. Let's just copy and paste these. Right, so again, you can see here what I'm doing is I am trying to, yeah, that looks okay. Looks kind of a bit strange. Maybe I need to wrap these in their own kind of div. Call this one like email input. Maybe each of these needs to be in the little divs just so I can give it some kind of some padding or some boundaries or something. So I've got myself now like 2 email inputs, as you can see here, like this. Yep, and then I might go and create some styles up the top. Now again, when you're doing this page yourself, you might often separate these styles out, and same with the JavaScript we're going to write. You might go and often put that in another file. I would typically recommend that you do it in the same file to start, just because it can be a little bit easier. Okay, so now I've got my 2 email addresses. I can also see that the page is quite tight on that margin generally, so I might wrap the entire page in some kind of div. I might call it main page, or you probably remember this from the first assignment, right? Sometimes it feels like you're writing a lot of just very strange div names that don't mean a lot, like main page, outer box, inner box. That's okay. Obviously do your best to try and write meaningful things sometimes, but it's only so avoidable. So, I might have my kind of simple page here. You will notice that a lot of Bootstrap components are by default quite responsive, so this works pretty well on mobile and other browsers. Again, from my tutorial, I think I kind of talked about how what we might do is say if we want to put like a max width on the page of 800 pixels, then we can also put, say, a auto margin on the sides. So remember, margin 20 pixels auto does 20 top and bottom, and auto left and right. So what this means is that I can actually have a centered page, but its max width's 800, so it maxes out at 800, then it automatically pads the borders, but once I go under that, it'll just kind of compress normally. You can see the problem with that, though, is that original margin that I gave it around the outside doesn't really work anymore. So what we might actually be wanting here is not a margin, but a padding. A padding of 20 pixels on all sides, potentially. Yeah, so you get something like that. So now this page is somewhat more responsive like this. Great. So you can see it's actually quite easy if you use the right tools to build somewhat responsive web pages. Ifan says, oh, it was meant to, oh, right, you're responding to a previous comment. Never mind. Okay, so we got our things here. We can also look at the Bootstrap library for buttons. I can't remember what buttons are labeled. There they are. If we give a button a class of button and then a color, let's just use button primary. So in this case here, I'll say, classes both button and button primary. Okay, so there's a nice little button. And then the text area, I don't know what the text area class needs to be, but let's just try form control and see if it gives me what I want. Just taking a guess. Okay, great, I've got that. And you'll also see that the text area itself is kind of a little bit small, so I might just go and actually give all text areas a minimum height, say, of 150 pixels, which will just help buffer it up. Okay. It's not working. Not sure. Oh, maybe, so, not sure. I imagine what's happening here is that maybe a Bootstrap library is overriding that height. Yeah, so what like CSS hierarchy is something that many of you probably came across in your first assignment, in terms of you'll often have, say, like your tag selector is like the least important, and then like a class selector is more important, and then an ID selector is more important, and then things are written inline are more important than any kind of tag you see. And this kind of this is obvious here because what's happening is that I'm defining properties on a text area, but the form control class element is probably defined in the CSS Bootstrap library, and we can kind of certainly see this if we just go and have a look with the inspect tool, right? So if I come here and I go inspect that, we can see the text area you can actually see it right here. That's the form control library. It has a minimum height of 1.5 EM plus 0.75 REM plus 2 pixels. I'm not 100% sure how I would describe that in words. But if we want to apply it, you can use the exclamation mark important tag. This is something you should be very careful using. I'm sure some of you have used it. Use it very sparingly because it creates more chaos in your code because, everything that has an important overrides everything without an important. But then also everything that's labeled important has a different hierarchy. So for instance, I'm pretty sure if I come here and I say, well, actually I want the height to be 100 pixels, you would normally expect that an inline style would overwrite a CSS style, but like the outlined, an external style. But in this case, this external style has important. So to override that, you then have to put important here, which didn't work for some reason. Don't know why, to be honest. Would have thought that would work. You kind of get the point though, like without me even digging too deep. It just adds mess everywhere. And it's really hard to then start tracking down and to Mitchell's point, it reads like not important if you're thinking about it like a programmer, right? So just be very cautious of using that. I don't want to use it. I would be much better off, for instance, actually giving this a unique class name, maybe such as big text area, potentially. So like, text area with class big text area. See, that works for me, and I can avoid that now because this, Now, why does this override it? Why does this one take precedence? Well, I'm pretty sure it's because the other style is defined in an external style sheet. Whereas this one is defined on the page itself. What happens if they're both written in external style sheets? Well, I'm pretty sure the last defined one wins. So it actually would then depend on the order of these things. In fact, that might even be the case now. Like, to some extent, I guess these things. So let's see what happens when I swap these around. Yeah, it's not actually about the external style sheet, sorry. It's pretty much solely to do with the order of them being defined. So whether they're defined inline in a style tag, or defined in a style sheet that's included, it's really just about the order. So this teaches you things like, for instance, when I install my Bootstrap library, I should go and put that at the very top of my head and do all my other CSS imports below that so it can kind of override those properties. But anyway, this page looks okay, right? Just with a little bit of playing around, a little bit of a library like Bootstrap, it actually looks kind of nice enough to get started with. So we've kind of got the core layout of the page together. We are missing an add more button. I think that's the only really key element that is missing, and we'll maybe make this one a different kind of property, like warning info. Is that gray? Blue? Yeah, it's kind of ugly, isn't it? Danger. It's the best color. Next week and the week after, we're going to be talking about accessibility and UI and product design and user experience. But for now, you can apply a lot of common sense when you're thinking about these pages. For instance, why would you have a red button? Red buttons tend to denote some really serious actions or removals. Blue is probably fine here. Or even you might swap these around, right? Like green is an idea. It's funny. You probably don't realize how much your brain has adapted to these things because something like this might, I'm not saying it does, but something like this might be clearer to you because you think blue's a very neutral color. So it's great. Like you wouldn't typically have a delete button blue, for instance. And if you're going to have an add more button and a submit button, a submit green might mean success or something like this. But generally, if you're not sure on colors, just kind of stick to blue. So we have our page here. Now, we haven't done any JavaScript yet. We haven't done any of the DOM manipulation stuff yet, or the event listeners. Now, I'm aware that many of the people who attend the lecture today have done task 4 for the assignment, but there are handfuls of students who will watch this lecture this week who did not attempt task 4 or they ran out of time. So please appreciate that I'm kind of going through some of the basics again in the demo for them. But I'm going to go and I'm going to start getting my JavaScript on the page now. Now, with a lot of JavaScript, you actually don't need to know a lot to do some basic things, such as task 4 and the assessment. Two of the most basic things that you need to be able to do are to be able to say document.getElement by ID to write an ID of an element, this HTML ID, and that essentially gives you an object. And that object is that HTML element on the page. And then the other common thing that we'll be doing is adding an event listener, or often we will be looking something up and then adding an event listener to it, which takes in a function of some sort. So most of what we're doing is really kind of just expansions on these two ideas of adding an event listener or just kind of looking up DOM objects. So there's a few different things in the spec that we want to do. And the first one we're going to do is try and change the color of this box. Has a text area with a welcome message. On blur, if the field is empty, color the background red until it's valid. Now Bonson has asked, what's the limit on the amount of Bootstrap classes you should put in one HTML class attribute? I don't think there's really a limit, to be honest. You'd be hard-pressed to add more than 5 or 6 a lot of the time, just by how these things are designed, and even by the limitations of how complicated you could make your own code. But I wouldn't overthink there being too much or anything like that. So if we want to say, if the text area is empty, color the background red. On blur, the first thing we want to do is capture an event. And those events are captured by adding an event listener. So I'm going to say a lot of JavaScript commands start with document. It's kind of annoying. I'm going to actually go and get my text area. Now I'm going to have to go and give this particular text area a ID so that I can reference it. Typically you'll find that most of the time that you want to do stuff with JavaScript, you need to give your HTML elements some IDs. That makes it much, much, much easier to work with. So here I say I'm going to go and get an element by welcome message. And you know what? I'm going to store that in a variable called welcome message. So I'm writing programming here now. And I'm going to console log welcome message. And let's just have a look at it in the console. So if I open up console here and I look at it, that's actually my HTML. It's interesting that it prints it out. I don't want you to think of this as a string though, because it's a little bit like in Python and Java. If you print an object out, it will overload it and print some kind of string representation of it. So don't think of it like a string, but that's what it is. It's the HTML element. Now what we can do with this is that we can add an event listener to it. So I can say welcome message.add event listener, and what I want to do is I want to add an event listener for when the component blurs. So most HTML tags have some fairly universal events that you can call on them, such as click, right? Or mouse on or mouse over and a few other things. But HTML inputs also have some extra events such as blur and focus. And this is kind of covered, I think, this is touched on in the events lecture. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and give this a function. Now remember that I can pass in a function, create an anonymous function like this that will do something, or if I use the newer JavaScript syntax, it kind of just looks like this. Inside of that, what I can do too is I can actually print out the welcome message's inner text. So now what you'll see is that when I click on this input, I've now focused on the input, but when I click off it, I've blurred the input. That's kind of it's clicking off it. It's no longer focusing on it. And if I type in something here like hello, and I click off it, it's still blank because okay, never mind. When I type hello and I click off it, you see that we actually get this hello being printed out. So when I click off it, because I've added this event listener, it means that the browser is just always waiting for that particular event to happen. And when that event does happen, it invokes this function. And this function takes that DOM element welcome message and it prints out the value of that DOM element. Value is just a property of that DOM element. There's a ton of different things we could print out if we wanted to. For instance, if I do welcome message.style on blur, I actually get a whole bunch of CSS styles. So all of this information is stored in the web browser. Like, don't think of HTML like a bunch of characters. Think of it like this big hierarchy of nested objects. So all these are CSS properties here. So .value is a little bit weird because .value is something that you tend to do on form inputs. Most HTML, at least I always get confused with this because with text areas, okay, let me explain what I'm saying. So with inputs, you might say something like value is hello. And that puts that in there. It's like the default text. With text areas, if you want to put the default text in there, you actually put it between the HTML tags. And normally to get the inner HTML of an element, I'll show you this, for instance, like, you know, if I create an H2 tag here called main header, if I want to get that text inside of main header, I could console log document.getElementById main header dot inner text. That's how you get like the inside of a lot of these elements. And you can see that it's printed out here. You don't do dot value. Dot value is kind of just for HTML forms and stuff, including text area. So some questions. Tanit says, is document.querySelector slower than getElementById? I don't know. Someone else here might know that. I've never tried to look into the performance of that. What is the difference between inner HTML and value? So inner HTML will actually get you the objects inside another object. So if I go and try and get the inner HTML of, say, the email inputs class, it will actually give me like the raw objects here to manipulate with. That's generally considered bad style and bad practice because it's considered dangerous, particularly setting inner HTML. It's a little bit too much power for your code, and there's a lot of room for things to go wrong because you could essentially set some malicious HTML if you want to. So generally we avoid doing that. We'll show you how to construct things other ways. Sunny says, for the script tag, what's the difference between type equals text JavaScript and type equals module? I see the latter being used in assignment 2, but I've been using the former. So it's a good question. It's not something I've had a lot of exposure to because, you know, the idea of using JavaScript like a module kind of became more popularized after I stopped writing much main JavaScript. But essentially, if you look up like a JavaScript module, type equals module, I know what it is, I just don't have the wording in my head. Basically, and this is true for Node.js too, when you deem something a module in JavaScript, it essentially defines it as a kind of package that can be imported into another file. So if you look at assignment 2, and we'll probably have a look at the code quickly today, you'll see that when something's labeled as module, some of the other JavaScript files actually import that JavaScript file. It's not something you really need to worry about in the sense that if you don't do it, you can still get away with it totally fine, but it just allows you to import things into another file. Jimmy says, does .value give you the actual file for file inputs and the actual JavaScript date object for date inputs? I don't think it does it for file. I think files are quite strange, generally. I haven't tried it out, but we can try it out for dates. Like, let's try it out, right? Text input equals date, class equals form control, and I'll give it an ID equals Jimmy. And then we can just print this out. So if I just now print out, if I just console log, say, document.that, Jimmy.value, I'll do it on blur so that we can enter it before we actually print it out. So if you follow the logic here, we're essentially going to like enter a date here. And then I'm going to click here. And then when I blur it, it's actually going to trigger that. So it just prints it out here as a string. Prints it out as a year, month, day string. Not this raw string. There's probably some more interesting things you can do with that. But yeah. One thing that's really cool to point out here too is the power of browsers. Oh, maybe that's Bootstrap actually. Let me get rid of the form control. But what happens is inputs like date didn't used to exist. Yeah, so inputs like date didn't actually used to exist in web browsers. It just used to kind of be text and maybe password. But eventually people were like, wow, people are using web browsers a lot. Maybe we should have a date input. So this date picker is actually managed by Microsoft Edge in this case. It's not written by Bootstrap, I don't believe. And that's really cool because it means you have to build less. In fact, again, if you've ever been on a website where you click on an input and it brings up the numpad instead of the keyboard, that's actually because the code has said number. And I can't actually type letters in. Like this is me trying to type on the keyboard, but I can type numbers in fine. So that's actually, again, this isn't HTML and CSS. This is actually baked into how the browser's built. So there's always new things happening in web, which is pretty cool. Now back to this, what I want to do to the question is if the field is empty, color the background red until it's valid. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to check. I'm going to say is welcome message.value, is it empty? And if it's empty, I'm going to color it red. If it's not empty, I'm going to color it white, say. So now I'm going to, instead of just reading from the DOM, I'm actually going to set a DOM property. So I go and get the object. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go get the style. So style is like a property that's like your gateway into all of CSS. So style dot, all these styles you're used to, you know, max width and padding and margin. People have asked me previously, you know, why is it max width without a dash? That's actually just because JavaScript as a language is not set up to have dashes as part of variable names or properties, just like most programming languages. So this is kind of the workaround. So if I want to set the background color like this, I can just set it literally like that. Set it to be red. So now when I click on this and I click off it, if it's empty, it runs that if, and then it runs that code. And then let's color it white now. Okay. So now when I click on it, I click off it, that's the blur. And then when I click back on it, and I click and I type something, and then I click off it, it's white. Now that's kind of a bit of a strange user experience, right? In the sense that, you wouldn't see this on a normal website where you like click off it and it's red, but then you start typing in and it's still red. What would happen? You know, I'd love to ask someone, tell me what would you do here to make this a little bit less janky, because it's kind of janky. This is not what you'd see typically. So answer me that. Then once we've done that, we'll move on to the add mores and the clicking and various other things. Just to answer Tanit's question about inner HTML. So inner HTML is a bit of a dangerous tag because, like, if I have a div here called blah, I don't use this much, so I might use it wrong. But if I say document.getElementById blah dot inner HTML equals h1 high, what has actually happened here is that the browser has tried to transform this string into actual HTML. There's a lot that can go wrong there in terms of parsing. It's not very expandable. It's not very reusable. There's some security concerns that I can't remember off the top of my head that you might want to Google. But generally, it's just not considered good design. It's a little bit, for anyone who's familiar with, it's like, that's another JavaScript thing. There's eval commands in some languages that do a similar thing. They actually take literal strings and execute commands. If you've used Python, the pickling library actually has a big warning on it as well, because the pickle library, for instance, will actually just take, like, it is essentially code instruction it's strings reconstructed into code. You know, all that kind of stuff is generally not considered good practice or safe unless it can't be avoided. So I think so Mitchell and Liam and Irfan have kind of, I guess, touched on what I was hoping we might get to, which is the idea of having an on focus. So when I click off this and it goes red, let's actually go and add another event listener for on focus, which is on focus is like when you click on it. And what I want to do is that when I click on it, I want to actually turn it white. So therefore, I actually don't need the second if statement, because what I can say is, you know what? When I start the page, it's always white. I enter something, all good. I remove something, it's red, and it stays red until I click on it again. You know, because when you click on it again, you're like, it's like giving a new chance. It's like, here's your new opportunity to not do something bad. And therefore, I'm going to stay white until you click off me, and then I'm going to kind of get angry again. You know, that's essentially the flow of it. Yeah, okay, so we got our little red box here. Now the next thing is this add more button. This is where things get to, so everything to this point is kind of probably very similar to what you have seen in task 4, for those of you who did it for assignment 1. The next thing though is actually going to be constructing some new DOM elements, and this is where things get a little more fun and really what you're going to see a lot of in assignment 2 in some ways. So it's really, really useful lesson. What I want to do now is have this add more button actually add more input fields. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and capture the, get element by ID, add more button like this, and I'll go and add like an ID to my add more button. Cool. And then I'm going to go add an event listener to it for clicking. Add more button dot add event listener, click, and then I will console log hi. Let's just make sure it works. Hi, like that, And by the way, I don't know if you needed this in your task 1, but just remember that all of these callbacks that are called, all of them are implicitly given an event object. And this event object contains a lot of information in it that honestly is probably mainly only useful for text inputs and keyboard inputs. The most common way, and I'll just really quickly show you this because, we're just demoing random stuff today. But let's say for a second that I went and put an ID on, actually we already have it on the text area, right? If I went and added an event listener to the text area, which was like on key down, so any time someone types a key in that text area, we'd like to console log something, So lots of console logs. You can see that number going up. I actually want to know what key they press, so I can actually capture in here an event. Events are passed into all of these, and you'll see there's a bunch of event information. And in that event information is things like key here. So I can actually therefore extract out event.key, and therefore I could capture what keys actually pressed. Hello there, how are you? So there's lots you can do with this. Lots you can just Google and learn and iterate fairly quickly. It's very well supported in terms of what you can find online. But I got my add more button. And what I want to do here is I actually want to go and copy and create another 2 div inputs. Before I do that though, what I actually want to do with you is show you how to construct one of these div inputs from scratch. And you're going to, again, do this more in your shoots this week. And what I mean by that is let's actually go and take these. Let's go and remove these for a second. And I'm going to come put them down here. I'll come put them like way down here or something. Like that. And just as notes. And let's go and try and construct these ourselves. So we're going to go and try and like totally construct one of these ourselves. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it in a function. I'm going to say construct email input is just a function. And then inside that function, I'm going to start trying to construct it. Now, what does this email input consist of? Well, the first thing it consists of is a div. So rather than writing, div class equals email input, I will... Sorry, it's just a bit hot in here, so I got the window open a little bit. So what I'm actually going to do is go and instead of writing the HTML, construct it with JavaScript. So what I might say is like email input div equals document.createElement. I haven't done this in a while, so I'm sorry if I forget something. Div like this, and then let's just console log email input div. And I'm just going to call this function immediately, which means that this is a function that I've defined, and it will get called as soon as the page loads. So I've actually created HTML here with this, right? So create element will go and create a div. Now what I want to do is I want to go and add a class name to that div, and I'm like, oh, I forget how to add a class name, so I Google, JavaScript DOM add the class name, and I'll go to Stack Overflow and I'll look and I'll be like, okay, class list.add. All right, let's try that. So I'll be like, cool, thanks Google. There's only so many ways you can do things. So now I'll say, okay, well, class list.add, and then what class do I want to add? Email input, because that's what's on my div here, right? So now when I go and add that and I refresh the page, it's like, cool, I've added a class to it. So we're actually kind of building out our JavaScript this way. And then I say, well, what's actually inside of that email input? Well, there's a label and there's an input. Okay, so let's go and create the label. The label is a new, create element. It's a label. And then I'll go and create my input, which is document.createElement input. And now I gotta add more attributes to these, right? Because they're not done yet. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to grab my div, my email input div, and I'm going to go append child, and I'm going to add my label, and I'm going to add my input. So I'm kind of like constructing a div, and then I'm constructing a label, a label over here, and an input over here, and then I'm just like adding them. You know, just like objects within objects. And now you can see I have something slightly more complicated here. It looks like it's, maybe I can print this out as like, I don't know how to print out raw HTML. Because you can see, I think because this is a more complex object, it's wanting to display it as like an object. Let me try this out. HTML, API DOM, raw HTML. Get unparsed raw HTML. You cannot get the actual HTML source code, blah, blah, blah. Inner HTML. Well, inner HTML will be like part of the way. When we talk about inner HTML, that's particularly bad to set things with inner HTML. It's okay. I mean, I don't really know many use cases you'd want to read from it, but like this is much less bad than actually setting it. You can see that inner HTML doesn't include the div outer parts. It just includes what's inside that div, but you can see we have actually successfully added this. So now I can go and come along and add those other properties I want to my label. So what do we have in a label? We have a for and a class. Okay. So now, I want to add these two things. So how do I do that? Well, I would say label dot set attribute. I believe it's set attribute. Set attribute is how you set an HTML attribute. So if I look at set attribute, it essentially is where you say this attribute is equal to that value. So here I could say, well, my attribute for is equal to email input 1, and then I could do the exact same thing for class. And you might be thinking, oh, don't we need to do the class list thing or whatever? Maybe. Like, let's try it out. Let's see what happens when I print my email input div.inner HTML. So when I print my inner email div.html, no, this works fine. But the thing is, you couldn't go and easily add a second class to this, right? So the class list approach is really useful when you want to kind of manage multiple classes at the same time. So I could actually go and change this just for consistency and say, you know what, my class is just going to be email input. And I'm pretty sure that there are other methods of doing that as well. So now I've got my label working, and I just need my input. My input has a few different things here. My input, for instance, has, what do we got? We got a type, so you know, input.setAttribute, type is email. We have a class, which is form control. We have an ID, which in this case might be, say, like email input 1, and then we have a placeholder, which is just name@example.com. Okay, should be making some sense. Okay, we've filled out our HTML. Now what do we want to do is we want to take our entire email input div and we want to append it to our email inputs class. But again, with JavaScript, if you can, it's generally a good idea to always give things IDs. So I'm actually going to go and change that from a class to an ID, and therefore I'm going to go and update this style to be an ID, such that I can easily now say document.getElementById, email inputs append child email input div. Great. So now when my page loads, it added that email input div there. It does look a little bit strange though, and that's because I forgot to add the inner text for my label. So that label should have had some inner text of that. And now it's looking kind of more of what we expected before. Except I should have called this form control. Is that the problem? Oh, no. Did I forget something? It just looks a little bit weird. I remember there being more spacing before. Oh, it's because, oh, sorry. There was never a class to email inputs. That was my bad. I just misread that. I thought we actually had, I thought email inputs had a class property. But you get the idea, right? So we've actually gone and constructed a DOM element. Now, if I want to make this function more generalized, much more useful to me, what I can now do is actually say, you know what, instead of this function adding it to the DOM, I'm actually just going to say that this function returns me the DOM object, so that I can then kind of come along and say, well, you know what? I'm just going to append this. You know, I'm just going to call construct email input like this. So it just appends that. And then I'm just going to go append a few of these things. Bam, 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 bam. Now, obviously, this isn't good because they all have the same ID, right? They all have the same input. Well, it's just a function. We're just writing JavaScript. So I can come along now and call it, you know, ID. And then I'll come and change all of my text here to use ID instead of 1. Same for here. I'll come and say, yep, ID. I'm changing my single quotes to backticks just so I can use that nice little JavaScript interpolation. Oops. You know, like that. And it's like, cool. All right. Done. Now, I actually have to pass these in. 1, 2, 3, 4. Great. And now I might write another function that's called like document add email input. And then I'll give it an ID so that I can just generalize this further. And you might be thinking like, you know, why am I breaking this up? Well, I just think it's good style to keep your, you know, to keep your construct object. This is like like every function, good, you know, software practices, every function should be responsible for one thing. This function is responsible for creating the email input box. And you could break that up further, but I definitely think you'd want to break it up like this. So now when I come down here, I could a lot more kind of cleanly do something like that. So now, oh, what have I done wrong? Unexpected identifier. What have I screwed up? Oh, document. Silly. Great. So now we have something like that. We've actually dynamically constructed those things, which is very powerful, and it helps us write our add more button easier too. What I now want to show you is how I would recommend that you do it in assignment 2. Because what we've done here is kind of painstaking. We have gone and constructed the entire DOM element from scratch. And if you do that for everything you want to do in assignment 2, it's going to be very painful. So I'm going to copy this out. I'm going to call this like hard, you know, construct email input hard. And I'm going to go and create a new function called, you know, construct email input. Now, what I'm going to do here is instead of completely construct the DOM from scratch, I'm going to use some HTML as a template. And this is worth paying attention to because you'll find this very useful in assignment 2. So what I'm going to do here is anything that I know I'm going to update, which includes the ID, like this, which includes this which includes the inner text here, because these are the things that change every time I kind of instantiate a version of this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go give this particular HTML 2 things. I'm going to give it an ID. I might call it template email input. And I'm going to set its style to be display none. Now, generally, you could abstract this out if you want to, or what might be better here is maybe if I like just create a class like hide that's display none. And then I come down here and I give this particular email input a class called hide. So, you know, now it's like, all right, well, I might make this bigger. We really don't need that much space over here. So now I've got this email input. Now, because it's hidden, right, it doesn't appear anywhere. If I was to not hide this, it would appear on the page and it would look weird. Right, look weird. But it's there, it's just hidden, it's just hiding. And what we're going to do is we're going to go and take that and we're going to essentially copy it. And I think, oh, how do I copy HTML? HTML DOM, copy, clone, I think it's clone node. So clone node is a particular method on an object that lets you copy it. I can't remember what the true does. Deep. You typically want a deep copy of things. Is it default true? No, default's false. All right, let's try that out. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to say, you know what? Hey, I actually really want to copy this. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to go, I'll get rid of some of these add email inputs. I'm going to say, well, my email input div is now, instead of creating it from scratch, I'm actually going to say document.getElementById. my template email input dot clone node true. And let's just console log that. Let's console log that and see what it gives us. Yeah. Okay, so we've actually gone and copied it, and it's got some inner HTML here too. Cool. So that's all that stuff. Now what we do is we go and fill in the blanks, and then we also remove those things that we don't like. We remove the two things I said we added, which was hiding it and the template name. So the first thing I'm going to do is input email input div. I'm going to remove attribute. I think it's remove attribute. I'm going to remove the ID attribute because I don't want that. Because if I keep that and then I add this to the page, there's going to be two HTML elements with the same ID, which isn't very good. And then also I'm going to remove a class, HTML DOM remove class. You know, I don't keep all this stuff off the top of my head. Add or remove a class. What do they got? Class list.remove. Okay, sure. I can copy off Google, right? Class list.remove, hide, and we'll see if that updates my element how we want, right? Because we want to get rid of this ID and we want to get rid of the hide class. Okay, so I got rid of the ID and I got rid of the hide class. Great. So all that's missing now are to do the things that we were doing before, which was add the email input to the for. So I'll just copy these down here. It was like this one, it was this one, and it was this one. Everything else was static. Okay, great. The problem is though, I don't have a label attribute anymore because I did not add it. I did not add that label. I did not create it from scratch. This is where we actually have to kind of look things up. So now I look up HTML DOM get child, right? Because I'm like, oh, I know I need to get a child because I have an element. I need to get the inner child. And then I look and I can see, all right, there's a child nodes object. That seems interesting. So maybe we can do that one. So let's try and console log what email input div.child nodes gets us. Okay, that gets us text label area form, text label input. Oh, why is there 3 texts there? The reason there's 3 texts there, and you might remember this from last week's lecture, is that how the DOM will actually render this is it will treat that white space here as text. So to get rid of those like different pieces of text, I would actually have to completely remove the white space on these things. That would get rid of those pieces of text. But, you know, who cares? We don't really care about that. Just before I move on, Tinitz asked a great question. There's a few other questions I'll come back to, which is what would happen if we set deep copy to false? Okay, well, let's see what happens if we set deep copy to false. We're currently printing out email input div, and then we'll set deep copy to false. Okay, I just don't get anything inside of it. So it only copies like the outer HTML element and none of the inner HTML elements. It's by default false because sometimes copying all the inner HTML it's just safer to assume you want less because it's easier, you know, it's less dangerous that you accidentally copy too much. So I still want to get the children. But I don't want to just get a list of children. I actually want to look up child. So, you know, again, I'm going to try and, you know, look up child. I'm going to, you know, Google this and figure out, okay, elements.children, body.children. That isn't quite what I want. I want something that can help me look it up. .children. If someone knows in the chat, I'd love for you to demonstrate. I just don't want to tell you everything. Finding child element. See if I beat you all to it. Query selector. I know people have looked up query selector before. But query selector is like an HTML, is like a JavaScript DOM function that's very powerful, but it's also very broad. There's definitely something more targeted that you can do. You can also just use the child nodes array as well, and just look up something directly if you want to. So for instance, if I say, well, you know what, I know I wrote this HTML. I know what it looks like, so if I just go child nodes here, I can see that, well, you know, there's 5 things, and I know that my label is number 1, so, you know, I'm just going to say, well, const label is just this, number 1, done. And then my const input is just number 3, I can see it right in front of me. I know what it is. It's not going to change because, you know, I wrote this code. And let's see what happens here. Okay, so I probably updated it. Let's look at the email input div. .inner HTML. Undefined. So I got to write it properly. There you go. Seems to be working. So now let's actually just return that email input div. Okay, cool. Well, that might have felt kind of hard because we had to look up some new things, but for much bigger elements, it's much easier to go and write it in HTML as like a template and then just kind of copy and paste that template. So, you know, in assignment 2, you'll probably be doing that quite a lot. Reese says we can also use children instead of child nodes to combat the text problem. Reese, do you want to explain the text problem that you're referring to? That'd be good just to round out that thought. Liam says still not great using indexes, kind of like magic numbers in code. Yeah, definitely. It's probably not a good idea. I don't think I would do it. One other way you can get around this is to essentially add class names. So for instance, here I could call this, like I give this like a class like in a label, or, well, you don't even need class names. You can actually, like if we go Google HTML DOM API, look up, you know, tag search or something, right? Now I'm just trying to remember the exact one. This is where we might need query selector. Find an HTML DOM based on attribute. I don't really want to look up something based on attribute. Get elements by tag name. There's a lot of DOM functions that you can call. And to like demonstrate what I mean, for instance, down here we've got our email input div. If I say console log email input div dot get elements by tag name, and then I say, you know, label, let's see what this prints us out. There's my label. So if you know there's only one label, then maybe that's a way to do it. You got to be careful though, because all of the get elements, if there's an S here, it's always going to give you a list. So if you know there's one, you can obviously kind of do something like this and say, well, okay, instead of saying email input div child nodes 1, I'm actually going to say go get me the only label that exists. This one would be more robust, definitely, because now you are, you know, it's kind of easier to guarantee that there's only one input label. You could also take this further and put like class names or IDs there and then remove them if you want to. So for instance, here I could say, you know, like ID equals inner label and ID here equals like inner input, and I could look them up by get element by ID here too. I'm pretty sure that would work fine. So if I then said like get element by ID and then I just call this one inner label, that's probably going to work fine. Oh, no, it's not. Oh, sorry, no, that doesn't work. I'm mixing up ideas here. You can look up class names inside things. That's what the query selector's for, though. The query selector's quite powerful. There aren't many rules about how we tell you to do this assignment. We kind of like leaving things open-ended where we can, when there's lots of ways to do stuff. Pretty much the one thing we do say, though, is just not to use inner HTML. The query selector is something where you can look up classes and tags, and it pretty much always returns a list, I believe. Yeah, it returns a node list. It's really like it's really just like a catch-all solution. It's like just a way to look up everything. You kind of have to be careful though with naming stuff, because I nearly would think that specifying it by tag is nearly more useful, because obviously if you use classes or IDs here, then you run the risk of collisions with other things, so you'd have to use very specific names. But to round out Reese's stuff, so Reese said before, we can also use children instead of child nodes to combat the text problem. With the white space between div and label, etc., I believe .children ignores this. Try and see. Let's try it out. Okay, so let's go and grab our email input div, and let's go and try that out. So we'll try and print out this .children and this .child nodes. Let's see what we get here. Great. So you can see again, just by reading a bit more, exploring a bit more, Reese has like seen here that, you know what, children actually ignores all of that white space. I'm not sure what the semantic is, But like child nodes, it's clearly treating this text like a node as well. You know, because everything, like if you think about, you can think about an HTML page as a giant tree full of nodes, right? Like that's what we mean by nested objects. So it's like, oh, cool. So if I was to actually reference things by their index, which is something you want to do sometimes, for instance, in a for loop, that's going to be a lot safer for me to use. So that's really great as well. Now, the point is, I've dragged this on. I really want to kind of finish this example up, take a short break, and then we can talk about assignment 2. My point is that now, because I've actually gone and generated these dynamically on the page load, when someone actually clicks the button now, what's the button? The add more button. Where did I put the... Yeah, when someone actually clicks this, instead of console logging hi, it's actually really, really, really easy for me to now just add more email inputs. So I'm going to go and grab this and put it down here just so I can see it. So now it's like I can just say add email input 3 and 4. Great. So now when I click this, it does that. Now the problem obviously is I've hard coded that in. Okay. So we need some kind of counter. What do we want to do here? Well, maybe I could keep some kind of global counter. Global email input counter equals 0. We might not even need the IDs anymore because perhaps we could actually just increment these in our function call. So instead of passing in an ID, I could maybe just put it there. Do you know what I mean? So now instead of calling this with an ID, I just call it and it will just kind of figure it out. It'll just increment it as it goes like that. Maybe that's the right approach. Maybe you want to keep an ID. I don't know. But you can see this expands itself pretty well. It goes to 10. And then if we go back to the spec as well, it has told us that we would like to stop until we reach 10 addresses. So this is easy too, because now what we can do is every single time we click the button, at the end of the click, what we can do is we can check, is the global email input counter, is that equal to, I guess, 9? And if it's equal to 9, sometimes I like to write this as like -1 equals 10. Because this is a tidbit. I think this is clearer because then if someone's like looking for like the 10 input limit, it's easier when you're scanning source code to see that. The alternative is to, you know, naturally just swap that around too. That's probably an even better approach. But yeah, if I see that, then what I'm actually going to do is go get the add more button, and I might actually just hide it. Style.display equals none. So if we reach 10, and it'd be even safer maybe to put this as like greater or equal to 10, just in case, you know, someone introduces a bug and it skips over it. So we got 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's gone. Can't add any more. Okay, so I'm just going to run through some of these questions before we play around with the submit button. So Reese has asked, does much of the marks from task 2 come from how good it looks, or can we get good marks with poor design and but appropriate functionality? I'm going to assume you're talking about assignment 2 there. Sorry, you wrote that after. Thank you. Very little with how good it looks. In fact, you know, we would consider this page probably looking good. If you apply some common sense and you use component libraries, you're going to find that's most of the battle done for you. Most of it's on functionality. You know, assignment 3, we have a few extra marks for how good it looks, but I think formally this assignment, it's like 5% of the marks come from if it's well usable, but that's not like super clean or anything. That's actually just like, yeah, this is usable, makes sense. I got buttons, I got a page. So it's a very small amount. It's not something we want you thinking about. Okay. Reese says, will we learn how to use jQuery this term? jQuery is a library that has fallen out I have a really quick tangent here. jQuery's usage spiked up. Oops, that's I don't know what graph I'm looking at. jQuery's usage really spiked up 10 or so years ago because what jQuery did was jQuery is a language, and what it did was it made writing vanilla JavaScript a lot easier. So I've written a lot of JavaScript in my life, and I'll give you an example. So what jQuery used to allow you to do was, say, for instance, instead of writing this, or instead of adding this add more button here, I could. So if I just copy this line, this is a very quick 2-minute kind of history lesson. jQuery is not a JavaScript framework like React and stuff. jQuery is a wrapper for JavaScript. It does not transpile, it does not compile, it is really close to JavaScript. It's like a syntactic improvement on vanilla JavaScript. So instead of writing this with jQuery, I would actually just write add more button dot click. Makes sense, right? So jQuery was essentially a library that was written that was still JavaScript in all ways, except it was just like, it was just, in terms of the writing of the code, it just felt more like what you would expect from a really thought out syntax structure in a language. So jQuery is quite light in that way. It's not a full-on framework. If you're ever writing vanilla JavaScript yourself, which I don't know why you would a lot of the time, jQuery is pretty cool. I'd recommend it. I've used it for really tiny projects where I'm just trying to do a couple things. You can't use it in this assignment, and we're not really going to learn to use it because, to be honest with you, if you actually learn vanilla JavaScript, which is the point of this, half the point of this course, picking up jQuery you'll do really, really quickly if you really wanted to learn it. But that's essentially the background on jQuery. Mitchell says, so can we make a little library of, let me click on the comment. So can we make a little library of components and then just create them and destroy them based on the state of the app? Just like a little mini framework. Yeah, exactly. That's kind of the point of this assignment. And I'm going to tie off this example. We might have a break and then I'll tie off the example to really make clear, like, you're like, hopefully you go, oh, I get what this is. And yeah. And Reese says, can't imagine we would need an ID for most of the element generation in assignment 2. I'm not sure if I'm understanding you correctly, but I'm not sure what you mean by can't imagine we'd need an ID for most of the element generation. Honestly, a lot of assignment 2 will be kind of stuff like this. We'll talk about the hiding component, but let's actually take a break. We'll come back at 7:20. Actually, let me pause it. So, hi everyone. Welcome back. So, we're just going to quickly tie up this example. I'm sure many of you who are watching live are starting to get tired. It's getting to that point in the evening. What I wanted to do to finish this off and hopefully really solidify to you the point of the assignment. We're going to skip the summary screen because like the summary screen is just a modal, and you know, if I really wanted to, you can do some of this with Bootstrap, but if I really wanted to give you a super quick summary of this, it's like what you might sometimes do in JavaScript, for instance, is you might have a show submit modal. You might have like a flag or something. In fact, you probably don't even need that, to be honest. You would have your button for submitting. You might give it an ID of like submit button, and you put this on another event listener. Oh, so Liam's asked a really good question, which is, shouldn't all of this be in the form? Yes, though there's a couple of things here. One is that the form tag is largely a relic of HTML submitted forms. So 20 years ago, with the the internet, one sec. 20 years ago, forms were all submitted through HTML pages, through submit buttons. Nowadays, what happens is that quite often we're manipulating stuff with JavaScript directly, like we have been. So therefore, they're not super critical in terms of functionality, but they are still quite useful in terms of accessibility, browsers interpreting them correctly. It really falls onto that topic of like good coding. It's kind of like you can have a page without the doc type and the HTML tag, and the browser will still figure it out, but it's generally considered good practice to include it. I'm just sloppy today, and sometimes generally. It's not the kind of thing that you would lose marks for on assignment 2. Maybe in the accessibility part. There's a whole topic on accessibility that kind of comes up in next week's lectures more so. That's worth checking out. Speaking of that, actually I'll summarize this at the end, but you know, just to be clear again, you know, I've got this submit button, and if I want this submit button to say create a pop-up, I could, for instance, create my own pop-up on the page, and that pop-up might say live here. it might be like, I'm just going to use div styles just to get this done. I might say, you know, width is 100%, height's 100%, position is fixed. And it has a background of some really light gray. It's like, oh, there's a pop-up. Now that's an ugly looking pop-up, right? And inside of it we could say like, you know, pop-up. Sure. Okay, and then by default, let's say it's like hidden. So how would we do a pop-up? Well, what I could do is I've got this pop-up I've created. I might call it like, you know, my like submit pop-up. And all I really have to do is that when someone actually clicks my submit button, for instance, I could just say document.getElementById that .style.display equals block. So now I click submit and that appears up. And then for instance, inside this pop-up, you could add more stuff if you wanted to, such as like a cancel button, cancel pop-up, like this, and then you could just put an event listener on that cancel. And also, I've been doing this thing where I keep separating out the object and the event listener. Often you would just write stuff like this. I just separated that out at the start just so people could kind of understand we're dealing with like objects here. But, you know, typically, what did I call it? It was like cancel pop-up, I think. Yeah, so here I could say like, well, there's a cancel pop-up, and when that's pressed, you're actually going to set the style back to none, like that. You know, so that's kind of how pages might deal with pop-ups. Now, that was a terrible incarnation of a pop-up. I'm just conscious of time. But the last thing is contains a second tab on the page that shows the previously sent emails. So how might we add a tab on this page? Now, in your assignment 2, you're not going to be dealing with tabs, I guess, because that's not a lot of what we've asked. You could do it that way. But let's just say, for the sake of it, I had a page here where I'm going to say div, or, you know, nav, right? I got my nav bar. And then I might have two tabs, and the first one might be form, and the second one might be history. Okay, and I put like a line between those two. Now I've got my little, you know, thing up here. In fact, I'm just going to wrap them in buttons because you can, you know. Typically navs, you wouldn't have them in buttons, but they might just be hyperlinks. I feel like I'm convincing myself to just make these hyperlinks now. href of hash is like a cheap way of just saying don't go anywhere, because if you actually don't have a hyperlink reference on your anchor tags, it will actually just refresh the page a lot of the time. So what I've got here is I've got my like two tabs, form and history. So now what I'm going to do is on my main page itself, I'm actually going to go and create like a content form, and then everything we just did from before, I'm going to go wrap it in that. And then everything for history, I'm going to go wrap it in that. And here I'll say, you know, this is the history. And now what I want to do, which is relatively simple enough, I'll give this like a, you know, style of display none. I do think we'll be somewhat relaxed with display nuns. I mean, again, we already made a hide tag, so that's probably, again, what I'd recommend people do. But you can see on this page now, that's not actually rendering the hide. So what I can do with my JavaScript now is I can say, well, you know what? If someone actually document.getElementById nav form, if someone actually clicks that, what I would really like to do is hide the history but show the form. So I could then say, you know, document.getElementById content history style.display equals none, and my content form equals block, and then I could do the exact opposite for, you know, my content, my nav history. So if someone clicks nav history, I actually want to show history and I want to hide form. And it's like, oh great. Now we've just created what we've been referring to in the course so far as a single page app. It's an app that's all the same page. We're not going to new pages, but it gives the impression that we're actually kind of navigating between things. And all it is very smart hiding and showing and stuff like that. And for those who've read the assignment 2 spec, and we're going to talk about that together in a sec, that, like, this is assignment 2 in a nutshell. It's pages, it's DOM. you know, it's all of this. I'm not going to finish this up because I could take this further and talk about local storage, but you know, we could talk for hours. But this is what it is. And in fact, everything we've gone through today sets you up very well for assignment 2, with the exception of anything to do with async and fetching. Right? So essentially, today is like everything except for actually talking to the server, which we'll talk about more in the assignment 2 lecture right after this. But that's just a heads up. So if you're kind of like, I know many of you are tired from assignment 1 and stuff, but when you do start it, my point is if you watched last week's lectures in week 3 and you've watched today, you really do get everything except the whole talking to the server part. That part is kind of for you to watch the lectures this week, and then we do a demo next week. Mitchell asked the question, this is the last question, then I'll wrap this one up. How do you get elements from a different file? It's a fairly natural question. What if I want to have HTML in a separate page, and I want to include it on this page? The short answer is it's just not really possible. It's just not how web browsers work. You can't really import HTML into another page. It's all kind of on one page. That's how single page apps work. You can have multiple JavaScript files, right? So let's say you could actually generate this whole page just with the JavaScript API, the DOM API, like what we've done down here. You could just do all that, but then you could break your JavaScript up into different pages if you want to, but that's kind of more work to generate everything, but everything has to be in the same HTML file, essentially. Cool. Okay. That's our demo into JavaScript browser. Sorry that this page cut itself off. That's a bit silly.